For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Shomulekai. Author Seán Morrow joins me to unpack the book titled The Bams of Grasslands Farm. Your book is about the Bam family from the Eastern Cape that survived and thrived despite colonial conquest and apartheid. So, can you briefly tell us about the Bam family? How far back does the history go? And what happened to the family during the Second World War?
That's an interesting question, particularly in this case, because the Bams were not a royal family from the Mpondomise, which is the group that they came from. So I at least have not been able to trace them back before the 1870s, when Solomon Bam, or Mchobi, his proper name was, became involved with the incoming colonialists. So I can take them back to about the 1870s. And that was a very chaotic and difficult time in the Eastern Cape, in what the Transkei, as it came to be known as. And Solomon Bam was a highly intelligent man who rode the different waves of incoming whites and missionaries and traders and all the rest of it, and managed to establish himself as an important person in that context. I'm going to jump now from that very early period up to the period that you asked me about, which is around the Second World War, but there's a lot of history between those two times, including Solomon Bam, his son, Chalmers Bam, a very important person in the book, and Lockington Bam, his son again, and then we're into Brigalia and the other siblings that are at the center of the book. They became involved in the Bunga, which many people watching this will know was the sort of highly controlled, I won't call it quite a parliament, but assembly in the Transkei. They became elite people in the Transkei of the time, fluent in English, Christians, and of course the land. That was the big achievement of Solomon. He got a huge land grant in Goqwana, which was the foundation of the family right through the 20th century. Let's jump forward to the Second World War, which you asked about, and it's a big jump because in the period between the two world wars, the family prospered, the farm flourished. It was called Grasslands, and indeed that's what it was. It was particularly for cattle and sheep and so on. But in the Second World War, all sorts of strains were beginning to turn up, which affected the Bams. Lockington, who was Brigalia's father, joined the South African army. Now, we're in the middle of a very racist South Africa, and black people really could not get commissions to become officers in the army. But he did become in as high a position as he could do as a black person in the South African army at the time. And the family was under great strain during the war. Even though Lockington never went to North Africa, where most of the South African troops were sent, it was a form, if you like, of labor migration, which is a common theme in the South Africa of the time. And he was in Pretoria, and his family, many of them were back in the Eastern Cape. And there were strains on his marriage, strains which they overcame. His wife, an important figure in this book, Brigalia's mother, Temperance Mazwi, from Matatiele, a Moravian, marrying into an Anglican come Methodist family. People got scattered. Brigalia, the little girl at the time, was left with her grandfather at Goqwana. Temperance had to make efforts to earn money, particularly to educate her children. Her little boy at the time, Fikile, Fix as he became known as, and Brigalia. And she managed. And it's a huge credit to Temperance that she managed to do that. So her children were dispersed with different relatives and so on. Temperance kept Fikile and Brigalia with her. They went to Holy Cross Mission Station. They got their foundations of their education there. And then things took a whole new direction after the Second World War. But the family did stick together in spite of these strains. They regrouped initially in Sophia Town, the famous Sophia Town in Johannesburg, and their careers take off from there. So that's some idea of the background and some idea of the effect of the war, which was drastic on the family.
And what inspired you to pen this book? Also, can you tell us about the research involved in putting this book together?
It's a long story, and we haven't time for long stories, but I did an earlier book on a very well-known South African anthropologist called Monica Wilson. And she was a highly liberal person at a time when South Africa was not by any means liberal, at least the ruling group in South Africa. She was a teacher at UCT. She taught anthropology there, and one of her students was Fikile Bam. And I interviewed Fix for that book and found him an extraordinarily magnetic and engaging person. And so I became interested in the Bam family from that point of view. But there are many other reasons too. I was always interested in the position of women in South Africa within the context of apartheid and all the rest of it. And of course, as you know, there were, I've already mentioned them, there was Brigalia, we know, and her mother and her sisters. And that interested me, the difficult position of women and the way that some of them managed to overcome those difficulties. And I was interested in education and religion and all these things. So a mixture of things were an inspiration for the book. And Brigalia contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing about her family. And between the two of us, we developed this idea of a history not just of her, not just of her brother Fix, but of the family. The research involved writing a history of a black family had certain challenges. It's not that people didn't write, indeed they did, letters and all sorts of things. This was a highly literate family. But through the difficulties of black life at the time, you might find exceptions. But on the whole, papers, which are so important for historians, didn't survive in the numbers that they did in other contexts. So a lot of this book is based on interviews with people. And luckily, I had access to all available living members of the family and many friends and people who could throw light on the Bam family. But not just that, of course, I went to archives as well. For example, the Cape Archives in Cape Town, which gave me some very interesting things about the actual farm, which was the heartland of the Bam family, and ones you might not expect, like the military archives, you know, for Lockington's time in the army, and then papers in Vets, in UCT, and so on.
And the book focuses on 6 brothers, sisters, and their ancestors, particularly on brother and sister Fikile and Brigalia Bam. So what influences shaped their lives?
They were different in some respects. I mean, they were brother and sister. They were, as I said, as small children, they were at school together at Holy Cross, an Anglican mission station in Transkei. And their lives, of course, took different paths thereafter. If you're trying to draw some kind of contrast between the backgrounds of the two of them, I would say that Fix had a more urban upbringing because he was in Sophiatown. He went to school in St. John's in Johannesburg. Brigalia went to school in Transkei, Methodist school, Shawbury, and then on to Lovedale. Fix was exposed to all that remarkable time in Sophiatown. Father Trevor Huddleston, the great figure in Sophiatown at that time, and all the sort of fascinating, perhaps quite chaotic life in the Sophiatown of the day before it was destroyed by the regime of the time. Also, Fix, and this is really unusual, he was one of the very last black students at UCT before the lid came down on that because of government regulations, laws. Fix became radicalized when he was at UCT. He became part of the Unity movement. He became involved with the different factions in the Unity movement, a left-wing Marxist movement, but not Communist Party. It was a different branch of Marxism. Became involved with the Uchi Chan Club, as it was called, and then the National Liberation Front, Neville Alexander. I'm just mentioning these names. They all have big stories behind them, you know, and interesting ones. Anyway, I better leave Fix there as a sort of a young man before he was arrested and carted off to Robben Island for 10 years. Brigalia, she was brought up in the Transkei in the Eastern Cape. Her experience was rural. She visited Joburg and so on, but she was a visitor there, you know. A huge influence on Brigalia was her grandfather, Chalmers Bam, who had a long, long life and was the person in charge of Grasslands farm for many, many years. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but the trajectory her life took was very much a church-oriented one. She was involved with Christian youth movements. Then later, as a young woman, she worked for the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association in KZN, or Natal as it was then. And that was an important part of her life as a young woman. And I know I've jumped around a bit, but it's difficult to pick out the things that shaped their lives. As Christianity and education, if you wanted to put it in two words, are crucial.
Talking about Christianity, so what role did religion and education play in the Bam family history?
Absolutely central. When you think of the hundreds of thousands of people in Transkei, this thin layer of educated people like the Bams were exceptional. The mission schools certainly were not perfect. They were racist people teaching in them and all the rest of it. But the thing about the mission schools is that they were based, as the later Bantu education and so on was not, on the idea that fundamentally people were equal before God. That was the starting point. Even if individual Christians or even communities of Christians failed to live up to that ideal, it was there. So people like the Bams, who were educated at mission schools, there was that basic sense of equality under God. And that the great criminality of the later Bantu education was that people were made to feel that they were not actually able to achieve, that they were a different sort of people who were inferior. The mission schools, I think, at their best, did not operate like that. And therefore you have these schools like Heeltown, where Brigalia and Fix's sister Jane went, for example. But of course, people like Brigalia made Christianity their own. It wasn't just a question of Christianity, which after all came from somewhere else, of it just being imported and given to African people. People like the Bams didn't have any sense that this was a foreign religion, I think, and it wasn't. It became something inside them. There were all sorts of tensions within churches, but they found a sufficient outlet for their individuality and their personalities and their intellectual development within these mission churches. Religion, education were absolutely crucial. I don't think you could conceive of writing about the Bam family without focusing on those dimensions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And earlier on, you touched on Fikile's arrest. So can you tell us about the circumstances that led to his arrest after trying to escape to Botswana?
This is quite a specific question and an interesting and actually controversial one, because Fix was involved with one branch of the Unity movement. Neville Alexander was the sort of leader, if you like, of the group that he was involved with. This group set up this thing rather grandly called the National Liberation Front, which was actually, to be honest, a group of mainly students, and not many of them either, in Cape Town. And the regime of the time arrested them and charged them with a crime called constructive sabotage, which was actually a way of charging people with violence and so on when they had not actually committed any. It was because they were amateur revolutionaries, as some of the people who were involved will wryly tell you today. I don't mean by that their ideas were unimportant or anything, far from it, but they were not going to shake the South African state, I'm afraid. They were picked up, all of them, and there was a sort of you can call it a mini treason trial in Cape Town. But Fix managed to evade arrest in Cape Town and then subsequently in Johannesburg, which was his sort of home territory, really, so he went there. And the idea was that he would escape to Botswana. This was 1963. But an arrangement was made for Fix and his friend to be picked up and to be driven to the Botswana border in Winnie Mandela's car and driven to the border. When they were driving out of Joburg, there was a roadblock and the police knew what they were looking for. They addressed, I was going to say humorously, I suppose they found it funny, but they addressed them as Mr. Solomon and Mr. Bam and went off with them. So people have wondered about that episode ever since. And one doesn't want to be too definite about these things. But a man, I mean, this is not something that I discovered. It was known already. But a man called Brian Somana, who had been asked by Nelson Mandela to look after or keep an eye on his wife, to help her when he could. Now, there's been all sorts of rumors and so on about the relationship between Sonama and Winnie Mandela. And certainly, Sonama was probably an informer. Now, that doesn't mean that Winnie Mandela knew that, or that by any means, but it's a murky episode, and it looks as though the authorities knew what was happening, and one can speculate that it was through Sonama. Appalling environments like that breed appalling episodes like that, And so the long and the short of it is that Marcus and Fix were picked up. They joined their colleagues in the dock, and he was sentenced to 10 years on Robben Island.
And lastly, Seán, after liberation, Fikile played a number of roles, including Chancellor of the Wits University and member of the board of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. So can you tell us more about his role as the founding judge president of the Land Claims Court, where he played a creative role?
Fix, in spite of all those enormous barriers and getting imprisoned and all the rest of it, he did qualify as a lawyer and as an advocate. And after he was released from Robben Island, he could not leave Transkei, which by now had become or was becoming a nominally independent state, under the Matanzamas and all that. But he qualified and he practiced at the bar in Transkei. He then went to work for a body in Port Elizabeth, which was defending people who were in trouble with the law. This was in the late 80s. With the changes of 1990, he worked with a private law firm in Joburg and brought himself up to speed with the latest developments in the law. And then he was chosen as one of the rather few prominent black jurists. He did not get chosen for the Constitutional Court, which I think disappointed him, but he was chosen to be the judge president of the Land Claims Court. It had 4 separate acts of parliament which came under its view, and they were all meant to improve and safeguard the lives of mainly black people. There's an interesting side to this, though, which will have echoes in modern South African life. Because the Land Claims Court, people would appeal to it if there were problems. But the Commission on the Restitution of Land Rights, that was meant to be the body that really got land reform going. But it was very slow. And the Land Claims Court found itself more and more having to take an active role in prodding the Commission on Restitution of Land Rights into action to do the things that it was set up to do. So Fix, I think, did that well. His view of law was quite an activist one. I don't think he was that interested in the theory of law and all the rest of it. He saw law as a means of pushing forward a progressive, people-oriented agenda. And that was what the LCC was doing. And in a very conservative profession, he was a very liberal-minded person. So Fix tried to guide this court in a way that was progressive and that tried to push South Africa and South African land policy, and specifically in directions that were more egalitarian, that would improve the lives of rural people. The court, by the way, was a travelling court. It moved around the country as it needed to, and it would hold its sessions in quite isolated places, sometimes in rural areas of South Africa, which is another dimension to how this court operated. And he also played a big role in training young black lawyers. And Fix did his level best to train young black lawyers to operate with confidence and competence in the courts. I think, just to sum it up, I think he did his best to introduce a sort of a democratic atmosphere in a very hierarchical profession.
That was Seán Morrow speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the Bams of Grasslands Farm.